Everyone, today is such an exciting day for me because I get to speak with H.W. Brands again, my favorite historian. I know I say that a lot, but because I love historians, but I want to show you something. I got this book, okay? Which, love that book. This book. Look at this. You got to read that book. But this one, look at TR. I mean, look at, he does not write short books, but I love this book so much. And then the last book that he wrote, this book I listened to, so I'm putting it right there, and it's called Heirs of the Founders. And, these are just the ones I have in print. I have Kindle. I listen to them. I love his books so much. If you love American history, you have got to watch him on YouTube because I love watching his lectures and read his books. As a matter of fact, like sometimes it's like, what do I want to do on a Saturday night? Do I want to watch a movie? Oh, you know what? I think I'll just watch HW. And then I watch another one of his lectures. He is an amazing speaker. So I got to talk to him on the phone today, and here's HW.
Hi, everyone. I am so excited because I get to speak again with Professor, Historian, Author H.W. Brands, and we're going to be talking about his brand new book called The Heirs of the Founders. And the rest of the title, The Epic Rivalry of Henry Clay, John Calhoun, and Daniel Webster, the Second Generation of American Giants. It came out in November, and thank you so much.
Delighted to be talking with you again.
Well, I've read almost all your books, probably 90% of them. So, I love your books.
Congratulations. That's a big job.
I actually tried to find one today that I haven't read, but I'm sure there is one out there that I haven't read. But it doesn't matter. I can read your books all day long, and I learn something new from each one of them. And I love this book. And what I kept thinking about while I was reading it was like, why them? Why did you pick them next to write about?
Okay. Well, in the first place, I have long noticed that there's an imbalance in the writing of American history. If you go to a library or bookstore and you look at the section dealing with the American Revolution, there are piles and piles of books. And then if you look at the section that deals with the American Civil War, there's an even bigger pile of books.
Mm-hmm.
If you look for stuff in between, in that roughly generation and a half era, between the American Revolutionary War, and if you include in that the framing of the Constitution, so the generation of the founding, that's gotten a lot of attention. Of course, the generation of the sectional crisis and the Civil War has gotten a lot of attention. But much less attention has been paid to the stuff in between and to the individuals in between, which was striking to me as a historian because I know enough about the subject to know that the leading figures of that era were, well, they were the rock stars of American politics. And I focused on, and I do focus in the book, on three who were considered to be head and shoulders above everybody else. And these are members of Congress. All three start out in the House of Representatives. All three advance to the Senate. They were Henry Clay of Kentucky, Daniel Webster of originally New Hampshire, but then Massachusetts, and John Calhoun of South Carolina. And these men were considered to be the most prominent, the most capable men of their generation, not excluding presidents. And one of the reasons I wanted to tell this story was to remind readers, remind American citizens, that it has not always been the case that the White House, the presidency, has dominated American political life or discussions of American political life or coverage of American political life. During the 19th century, during the late 18th century and the 19th century, Congress was at the epicenter of American politics. This was by the design of the framers of the Constitution. The Constitution puts Congress, the legislative branch, in Article 1. It's the longest article. It's the most detailed. It's the one that clearly the framers of the Constitution paid the most attention to. They were modeling the American government in that respect on Parliament. And there had been what the English call their glorious revolution of the 1680s that made clear that Parliament was the dominant player in British politics and the monarch, the king, subordinate. And they wanted that for the Americans wanted that for their new republic. So Congress would play the role of Parliament. It would be the initiator of legislation, and in fact, that's the way it works under the Constitution. That's the way it's supposed to work. The president would simply wait and he would execute. It's called the executive branch because the president would execute the will of Congress. So I wanted to go back and recapture that time when the great figures of Congress were the great figures in American political life. And these three, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John Calhoun, stood above the rest.
And, I read your biographies. I homeschool. I'm a homeschooling mom. And I used your 5 biographies to homeschool my son his senior year to teach, to teach him. So I just broke. And so because I read them with him, like you touched on this in the Andrew Jackson. Like I felt like I was very well read on Andrew Jackson, and then Ulysses, goes further in. But you touched on him. But what I loved about this book is you went so much deeper into even Andrew Jackson and the other presidents.
Well, so from the standpoint of a writer, I found that there was an interesting and different challenge in writing what amounts to a 3-way biography than a biography of a single subject. When you write about a single subject, all roads lead eventually back to your subject. Try as you might, you cannot help giving the impression that the world revolves around your subject. And even if your subject is the President of the United States, who is a pretty important figure, the world doesn't revolve around any single individual. And the other thing is that if you want to engage the reader, again, as an author, you need to develop a certain sense of drama, a certain kind of conflict to bring the reader along, to get the reader to be emotionally invested in the story and want to know how it turns out. If your focus is on a single individual, the drama, the conflict always seems kind of lopsided. So you can develop the foils to your character, but over the long life that you write in a biography, the foils come and go. And so the foils, the other side of the story, never gets quite equal billing. And so after I finished that series of biographies, I decided that I was going to change the format a little bit. So my first foray in that direction was a book that focused on Harry Truman and Douglas MacArthur, both in the middle of the Korean War. And it's a 2-way story that allows me to argue both sides of the story, or more precisely, put the readers in the heads of 2 determined, powerful figures at this moment of crisis in America and world history. So I do my best in that book to let readers understand what Harry Truman was thinking, what Douglas MacArthur was thinking. With this book, the current book, Heirs of the Founders, I expand my circle to 3. And 3 is kind of even more interesting because, as anybody who remembers junior high school will recall, 3 is an unstable number in relationships because it's always 2 against 1. And very often, the 2 on one side will shift and somebody will swap sides and side with the other person. So it's always a shifting 2 against 1. And that's the way it was with the 3 characters that I write about here. And sometimes the shifts were over matters of policy. So one of the big issues that was a live and very controversial question during the lifetime of these 3 was something that, actually, when I was writing the book, I was writing about this topic, and I thought, oh, man, this is a sleeper in American politics these days because nobody's been talking about it for 80 years. But President Trump revived the issue, and that is the tariff. Well, the tariff was a big deal in the 1820s, and then it disappeared in the 1940s in American life and only revived in 2017. Anyway, so at the beginning, Henry Clay and Daniel Webster were on opposite sides of the tariff issue. And John Calhoun was on the same side with Daniel Webster against the tariff. So Webster and Calhoun were against the tariff originally, and Henry Clay was for the tariff. But over a period of years, the alliances shifted. Henry Clay remained in favor of the tariff, but Daniel Webster switched sides. So he went from being opposed to the tariff to being in favor of the tariff. Now, some of this reflected the persuasiveness of Henry Clay. One of the reasons I chose to write about this group was that these were the greatest orators in the golden age of American political oratory. And when Daniel Webster would speak, when Henry Clay would speak, when John Calhoun would speak before the Senate, people in Washington dropped what they were doing and raced to the Capitol, trying to squeeze into one of the seats in the Senate gallery, because the speeches by these individuals, and these weren't short speeches, they would go on for hours and hours, sometimes spilling over into 2 or 3 days.
Wow.
But they were educational, they were edifying, they were entertaining, and they were important in a way that no political speeches these days are important. The art of political speaking has largely been lost. Presidents, well, they give the State of the Union address, and sometimes people pay attention to their inaugural addresses. And the current president speaks sort of at rallies. But these are not speeches that are designed to actually change people's minds. And perhaps President Trump is the best example, or maybe the culmination of a trend, where there's a strong tendency to speak to the choir, to just tell the people who already support you what they want to hear. But in the days of Clay, Webster, and Calhoun, when the Senate was at the center of American politics, speeches given in the Senate changed people's minds. Other members of the Senate would sit and listen, and they would be moved one way or the other by these speeches. And so there was a lot riding on these speeches, and also just the command of the language that these 3 men had was enough to make any student of modern American politics weep when the preferred mode of communication is, well, with the current president, with Twitter. 148 characters, I guess 280 characters now. When Daniel Webster could speak for 5 hours and never skip a beat. His speeches were moving. He could make audiences laugh. He could make audiences cry. They were powerful intellectually, and they changed people's minds. When Daniel Webster spoke, he was interpreting, he was construing the Constitution. This was in the early age of American constitutional interpretation. The Constitution that was written in 1787 is really just a skimpy outline. To flesh it out, to fill in between the lines and the outline, was the challenge of the generation of Clay, Webster, and Calhoun. And so in the book, I cover the speeches. I give enough of the speeches so that readers will get a feel and a flavor for what was going on, and also a sense of the political stakes and the intellectual insight that the speeches convey.
Yeah, and what you were saying before about how, American history, we go from the Revolutionary War to the Civil War. I realized when I was homeschooling that that's how I was taught in school. And I remember thinking, you go from the beginning of this country and everybody's together, and then all of a sudden we're fighting against each other, and you're like, how did that happen? And then,
right.
But when I read this book,
that's exactly what this book is about.
Yes. Yes.
And there's another thing that I try to recapture for my readers, and that is the sense of not knowing the future. Mm-hmm. So when we know history, especially when you're dealing with big issues like this, you and I know there's a civil war coming. But Henry Clay didn't know there was a civil war coming, and Daniel Webster didn't, and John Calhoun didn't. And Daniel Webster and John Calhoun did their best to make sure that a civil war not come. They believed that would be a disaster for the country. John Calhoun was more ambivalent. By the end of his career, he was certainly hoping for Southern secession. He didn't want a civil war. He thought the secession could be accomplished peacefully. But if there is a takeaway for modern readers, modern students of politics from this book and from this era and the experiences of these men, it is that was a time in American political life when compromise was considered worthy, was considered honorable. These days, to call somebody a compromiser is effectively an insult because it conveys a lack of conviction. You don't have the courage of your beliefs. You're not willing to stand up for what you believe. But in those days, there was a recognition that democratic politics, small d democratic politics, is really the art of compromise. It's the art of accommodating different views. There was a willingness to believe that my political opponent is not my enemy. My political opponent has a right to his opinions and a right to a seat at the table. And effective legislation, political reforms, political laws that last are the ones that make sure that everybody involved has a say in the creation of the reformer and the passage of the law, because those are the only ones that will be stable. If you have a majority and you ram your legislation through on a straight party line vote, you invite the other side to begin to sabotage it right away and to overturn it once they gain political power. And so Henry Clay, of the three, had the greatest reputation as the compromiser. He was called the Great Compromiser, and he wore that badge with honor and great respect because he recognized that he was the one who had kept the Union from falling apart in 1820 when there was a debate over the admission of Missouri as a slave state. This gave rise to the Missouri Compromise. There was another compromise in 1833 over the tariff that I described earlier, a compromise in 1850 over the admission of California as a free state, and the thing that the South got in response to that, because the admission of California as a free state would unbalance the Senate against the South, was a strengthened Fugitive Slave Act. And in each of these cases, neither side got everything that it wanted. Each side came away grumbling at the other. But in none of these cases did either side say, okay, we didn't get enough out of this at all, and we're going to knock the table over, and we're going to start over again. So the story of the lives of these three is, as long as they lived, they were able to maintain this spirit of compromise. They die in the early 1850s, and with them dies the spirit of compromise. And within 10 years, the compromising is ended, and the U.S. is in the middle of a civil war.
Yeah, and I love how the title, Heirs of the Founders, because it's like we think about and when they were putting together the Constitution, okay, and that had its own importance and relevance, but then it's like these guys were left to say, like, well, okay, so what are we going to do with this now? Like, how are we going to do this?
As a matter of fact, the germ of this book originated almost 20 years ago when I wrote the last line to my biography of Benjamin Franklin. Franklin has been involved in the Constitutional Convention of 1787, which was held in secret, so the people of Philadelphia didn't know what was going on behind the closed doors. But the last session ends and everybody comes out. Franklin is accosted by a woman in Philadelphia. He says, Dr. Franklin, what have you given us after these 3 months? And he says, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. So Franklin was conveying both the accomplishment of his generation, that is, the creation of this new republic, but also the challenge to the next generation. Can you keep it? Franklin understood that the Constitution was not a perfect instrument. There were some serious gaps that could not be that were papered over, but couldn't be resolved in the Constitutional Convention. And the two principal gaps were, where exactly is the boundary between federal authority and state authority? And when push comes to shove, who wins? And the second one was, can a republic, a political system based on a fundamental equality of the people, can it accommodate slavery, which is the most egregious form of inequality? Franklin understood that these would be problems for the next generation. This is why he said a republic, if you can keep it. That was the challenge to Henry Clay and his generation. And it was a challenge that they rose to. The three of them died in the early 1850s, John Calhoun in 1850, Webster and Clay in 1852. And at the time of their death, the Union still held. They had kept the republic. The generation that followed was not so successful, or perhaps maybe not so devoted to this concept of keeping the republic. And the republic fell apart. Now, it was put back together by military force, but that was definitely not what Franklin had in mind when he said, can you keep this republic?
Right. Well, this book was so much fun to read. I feel so knowledgeable now. I mean, I told you the other books were the beginning of, I got to understand what was going on during this time. But now after reading this and I just feel like I know the three of them so much better. And not that, because I always used to focus on just presidents. I mean, and if I could do that, that's quite a, that's pretty good too. But I love learning about the other people involved in the government and their contribution. And that's what you give us in this book. And, it was just incredible. And I do remember you talking about this the last time we talked, you were, talking about this book. So before I let you go, what's next? What do we have to look forward to?
Well, next up is something that takes us in a different direction. It's a history of the American West. I've written a couple of books on the history of the West. I wrote a book on the California Gold Rush, and I wrote
Oh,
one on the Texas Revolution. So this rounds out the story.
awesome. Because I think I didn't read the Texas one. Now I'm like, oh, I got to go back and read that one because I don't think I read that one. So, but I did read the one about the West. So I am really looking forward to it. I look forward to each and every one of your books. And I was thinking about you this summer. I went to go see the estate of TR, and
Oh yeah.
I was talking to the guide, and I was telling him everything that I knew, and he was like, "How do you know this stuff?" I'm like, "Because I read TR." Two
Okay.
brands, and it was so much fun to see it after reading that book. So your
Mm-hmm.
books live on.
Well, thank you.
Yes.
Glad to do.
So everybody, I'm going to put all of his links listed below, especially the one that's listed for the Amazon link right to this book. It's been out for about a month. It is getting such great reviews, and I'm so happy that we got to talk again. Do you have a date for the next book?
It's going to be sometime next fall.
Okay, great. Awesome. I look forward to it. Thank you again for talking with me.
It was my pleasure.
Okay, have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Wasn't he amazing? Oh my gosh, I could listen to him talk all day. I swear, that's why I watch him on YouTube a lot, okay? And it's really hard for me to like control myself when I'm talking to him because I want to treat him like a rock star, and I don't think he wants me to. So I like really control telling him how much I love his books, and I only said it a couple of times. So I'm really proud of myself. But anyway, everyone, links are listed below. Thank you for listening to me talk to HW. If you love American history, just go to his books, okay? Nobody does it better. All right. I'm already looking forward to the next one. So thank you, everyone. Have a great day.